Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever time it is that you're watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. On this program, it's my pleasure to lead discussions about all things Bible and theology, and I get to do that with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors. Today, we are continuing a conversation we started in our last episode with Dr. Daniel B. Wallace on the subject of textual criticism and the New Testament manuscript evidence. If you did not listen to that previous podcast episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it first, as today's episode will be building upon that one. Dr. Daniel Wallace is Senior Research Professor Emeritus of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's also the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. He's been a consultant for several Bible translations and is a member of the Committee on Bible Translation, which is responsible for all revisions of the New International Version. He's written, edited, and contributed to more than 36 books and many journal articles. His book on advanced Greek grammar and syntax is the standard work used today in Bible colleges and seminaries around the world. Dr. Wallace is one of the premier experts in his field of textual criticism and the study of New Testament manuscripts. I'm personally thankful for his teaching ministry, as he was my Greek professor over 20 years ago now. Please join me and listen in on our previously recorded episode. Well, would you tell us more about the quantity of variants? How many variants are there? And then we'll talk about the viability of those variants, but how about the quantity of variants?
Well, we've already defined what a variant is. We've already mentioned how many manuscripts we have. The official number for Greek New Testament manuscripts is now 5,999. And earlier I said we have over 5,500 manuscripts. That official number is not the actual number, and there's a number of reasons why. One of the most common is if a part of a manuscript is discovered and they didn't realize it was a part of another manuscript, they might give it a new classification or a new catalog number. The official cataloging of all Greek New Testament manuscripts, the way New Testament scholars know about these manuscripts, is done in Münster, Germany at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, INTF. And they found, for example, there was one manuscript from the first millennium, Codex 070. It didn't have a letter, just 070. And that was found in several different places. And each one of those sections got its own catalog number. Maybe there's 8 different sections of 070 throughout the world. Well, they didn't know that that was all from the same manuscript. So those 7 other numbers, now that's not part of the official. So the 5,999 comes down. So it's a very safe thing to say we have at least 5,500 manuscripts. I think it's probably closer to 5,800. Okay, so textual variants. With these manuscripts, we have about 1.5 million textual variants among our Greek manuscripts today. Nobody has done the official count, but a former intern of mine, Peter Gurry, did what comes as close to an official count as possible. And he got this published in New Testament Studies a few years ago. He's now a professor at Phoenix Seminary. And what Gurry said was, by looking at, there have been exhaustive studies on like a chapter in John or a whole New Testament book where all the manuscripts were examined and all the variants were listed. And so based on those samples from different portions of the New Testament, where we do have exhaustive studies, Gurry could tabulate how many variants we have. Just use it. It's a poll that's within 3% this way or that way. So he said we have approximately 500,000 variants. What he did not count are those spelling differences and nonsense errors. And those are the largest portion of our variants. So when you look at all of these, we have about 1.5 million variants. Now that could scare anybody if that's all they knew, the quantity of variants. But when you actually examine the number of variants and compare it to the nature of variants and which ones are viable and which ones are meaningful, then we realize that the whole field of textual criticism is a finite field where we can handle the data.
So could you tell us, what does it mean to be a viable variant, or what was the other term used, viable or meaningful?
Yeah. The vast majority of our variants are neither meaningful nor viable. That's probably, I'd say 70% of them, something like that. Then you've got those that may be meaningful, but they're not viable. That means that they change the meaning of the text in some sense, but they're not viable. That is, they don't have any possibility of going back to the original wording. You might get a 14th century minuscule manuscript that was copied in Constantinople that has very interesting wording in a text, but how in the world could that have slipped through 14 centuries of copying so that this one scribe gets it right? Well, that's a meaningful variant, but it's not viable unless that manuscript actually has a really strong pedigree. We do have some, like Codex 1739. It was a 10th century manuscript copied, 9th or 10th, I forget the exact century, copied from probably a late 4th or early 5th century manuscript directly. And we even know the scribe, his name was Ehrman, and he worked in Constantinople. He was training to be a lawyer, so very punctilious, exacting, and instead he decided to be a scribe. We have 5 of his manuscripts that we know he wrote, and 1739 is one of them. It's the very best late manuscript that we have for the whole New Testament. It's written in cursive or minuscule hand, and it's equal to one of our great 4th or 5th century manuscripts. It's really amazing. But if you have some scribe that he just copies exactly what all the other Byzantine scribes are saying, and then has one meaningful variant, that's not going to go back to the original. We can discount that, and you have to have some plausible path for it to go back to the original. Okay, so that would be meaningful. A viable variant is that, yeah, this really does have a possibility of being in the original wording. Those that are viable and not meaningful is a pretty large category. Those that are meaningful and not viable is a pretty large category. And you put together the neither meaningful nor viable, the largest category, those that are meaningful but not viable, those that are viable, that is, they really could go back to the original, but not meaningful, spelling difference, more than that, just things that are just totally inconsequential. We're dealing with more than 99% of all textual variants. In fact, the best estimate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 99.8 or 9% of all textual variants. Scholars, especially skeptics, will say the variants don't just number in the hundreds, but the thousands. And Bart Ehrman is famous for making this comparison. There's actually more variants in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. It's one of his few understated facts. We have 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament, give or take a few, depending on which version you're using, and 1.5 million variants. So we've got more than 10 times the variances we have in the New Testament, words in the New Testament. But how many of those are actually examined and considered worthy of examination by scholars? About 0.1%, about 1,500 places. So scholars will paint chicken littles with all this other stuff, but it doesn't matter. That's not the stuff that really counts. In our meetings, every year we meet in November for 3 meetings where textual critics get together and they compare notes and talk about what they think the original wording is. And, somebody produces a great deal of evidence. There was a whole dissertation done at Baylor University on one word in Mark chapter 1. Guy spent thousands of hours and says, this is the original word, but not this. And I think he's right. But in other words, there have been millions of man and woman hours that have been put into researching the New Testament. And the text of the New Testament. And yet what really counts are those few hundred variants that we even talk about.
And I like how you often emphasize the fact that we have so many variances because we have so many manuscripts, right?
Right. That's why Richard Bentley said it's good to have 30,000 variants, because we can compare the manuscripts with each other. The amazing thing about the New Testament is it gets copied early on and very often, so that we can do those kinds of comparisons. In other words, there was no control over the copying of the manuscripts in the early centuries. Precisely because there was no control, we can make those comparisons and find out what the original wording is.
And when we think of the New Testament, you often also say it's not that we're trying to reconstruct it, right? It's either we've got A, B, or C, so we have to figure out which of the options. It's not, especially with the New Testament, we don't have to try to reestablish it or
we don't need to use
it
conjecture to come up with what the original wording is. I would say that our options are A, the text, or B variant, or C variant, or D variant if there are that many, but never none of the above. We have the original text either in the text, the body of the Greek New Testament, of these published ones, or in the footnotes, the apparatus. We're not guessing.
The illustration I often use as far as meaningful and viable, I think of 1 John 1:4, right, where it's John says, we write these things to make our joy, hemes, or your joy, humes, right? One letter difference between the Greek, the upsilon versus the eta, but the theological difference isn't huge, is it?
Hemes means we, humes means you, and because the sound of those letters was the same after a couple centuries of when the Greek New Testament was done, there's a lot of confusion where you get either variant, and you have to look at the context and what's the author most likely to have written, and that's where you look at places where there aren't meaningful and viable variants for the author to establish that author's usage. So yeah, those are challenging, but gee, that's going to shake my faith. Does John say his joy or our joy? Man, that goes into my doctrinal statement. We believe in 1 John 1:4 that says our joy. Nobody has that in a doctrinal statement. It's important for the meaning of that passage, but it doesn't change any essential belief. There are no viable variants that change any cardinal doctrine of the Christian faith. And we could extend that much further and say probably there are none that change any even lesser doctrine, a less important doctrine of the faith.
Very good. Well, Dr. Wallace, would you give us a few examples of meaningful and viable variants?
Yeah, I can give some that I think are very interesting. I'll start with 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where Paul is writing to the Thessalonians. He'd only spent a few weeks with them, and he speaks of himself and his colleagues as we became either gentle among you, or we became babies among you, or little children. Those two readings, it's really difficult to figure out what the original said. In the Greek, it's a single letter difference. We became apioi among you, gentle, or we became napioi, babes, little children. Most scholars say if Paul said we became little children among you, that is a violent metaphorical change, because the next line says like a nursing mother. We became little children among you like a nursing mother. Well, so most scholars in years past have said it means gentle, not little children. The problem is that if you punctuate it differently, and I think the Greek lends itself very strongly towards a different punctuation, Paul is saying, we became little children among you, full stop, like a nursing mother. Then it goes on and tells what a nursing mother does. And in 1 Thessalonians 2, the very chapter this is situated in, Paul speaks of himself as father, orphan, brother, mother, and little child. So he's using all the family metaphors. Why are we saying little children isn't going to work? Now, the word before is egenethemen. That's the word for we became. It ends in a new or en. The next word is either apioi or napioi. Paul is dictating this letter to his associate who's writing it down, because Paul always used a secretary to send his letters out, except perhaps in the letter to Philemon. But he's dictating, and so he says, aganathema napioi. Well, what did he say? The scribe who's writing it out might have heard apioi, and then, which means gentle. We became gentle among you. Or he might have heard napioi. Scholars debate what the original word was that Paul dictated, and the manuscripts go all over the place for that. So that's an important textual variant, and it affects the exegesis of that passage, but it doesn't change any essential belief by a long shot. I got to mention, there's one manuscript at 1 Thessalonians 2:7 that doesn't have apioi or napioi, it has hippoi. We became horses among you. And I'm going, oh my gosh, is this a Denver Broncos or a USV Trojans fan? I mean, what's the deal here? So that's what you'd call a nonsense reading, because it just doesn't fit, like Codex L saying the one comes after me is heir, But it's funny to see those kinds of things. Obviously, some scribe is not paying really good attention. Another textual variant that doesn't affect orthodoxy, but it may affect orthopraxy, how we should live, in kind of an outskirt way. It's not a central thing in terms of the Christian life. Mark 9:29. Jesus' disciples had tried to cast out some demons, and they were unsuccessful. They came back to Jesus, and they complained about this particularly pesky demon. And Jesus says, this kind cannot be cast out except with prayer and fasting. Or did he just say, except with prayer? Period. And fasting is a textual variant. And the manuscripts are really split on which way they go there. So, when it comes to exorcisms, do I have to fast? Well, I'm not sure about that. So, I don't know how many people that's going to affect, but that's my advice. If you're involved in casting demons out, probably not a bad idea to fast also. Okay. Here's another one that is far more well-known than these other passages. It's Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. And in Revelation 13:18, John says, and the number of the beast is 666. It's the number of a man, or it's the number of mankind, perhaps. 666, everybody knows. Everybody knows that's the Antichrist number. I mean, it's a part of our popular culture. And you get movies that have that kind of stuff in it. And so if you went down on the streets of Dallas, you'd say, hey, what does 666 mean? Oh, that's the Antichrist. That's the devil, something like that. They all know it. Well, not so fast. In 1843 and 44, Constantine Tischendorf, the man who discovered Codex Sinaiticus in 1859 at the St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, he was at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and he was looking at one of only 4 manuscripts that had originally been a complete Bible, the whole Old and New Testament. 2 were done in the 4th century, 2 were done in the 5th century. This was Codex Affremi Rescriptus, done in the 5th century, early 5th century. Rescriptus means it was scraped over again. In Greek, it's called a palimpsest. What happened is, many centuries later, somebody looked at this manuscript and cannibalized it. They just scraped over as best they could the parchment to get rid of that underwriting so they could write somebody's sermons on top of it at a diagonal, So they would use a sheet and they'd flip it upside down. It just didn't matter. That's what they did. Well, to read that undertext, it takes patience. It takes real diligence. And it also helps if you have UV light, or if the manuscript had already been treated with chemical reagents, which had happened with Codex Affremi Rescriptus. About a decade earlier, the National Library in Paris had applied chemical reagents to this manuscript, which brought up the undertext so you could see it pretty clearly. Still, it took Tischendorf 2 years to decipher 147 leaves, 2 years of work, and he was able to read 99% of the manuscript. This manuscript has become the second most important manuscript we have for Revelation. Codex A and Codex C are the most important manuscripts we have for Revelation. And as plain as day at Revelation 13:18, it says the number of the beast is 616. I saw that in the flesh a few years ago. It's part of the Grand Reserve in the National Library, and I was allowed to look at 4 manuscripts, all of which were on the Grand Reserve. This was the one that was really fun to look at. So I saw in the flesh, this manuscript says 616 for the number of the beast. That was the only manuscript we knew of until 1998. In that year, I believe that was the year, the Egypt Exploration Society published 17 New Testament papyri that had been housed at Oxford University's Sackler Museum, all excavated in the early decades of the 20th century by Grenfell and Hunt, and excavated from a garbage heap in Egypt, in the town of Oxyrhynchus. And what they found were thousands upon thousands of papyrus fragments that had writing on them. And Oxford University, with the Egypt Exploration Society, has the largest collection of them in the world, 500,000 papyrus fragments with writing on them. And as they went through several of these, I mean, it just takes forever to go through all 500,000 and find out what's there. What they discovered is a manuscript. It's all fragmentary. It happens to be the oldest manuscript we have for Revelation 13:18, and it's 26 postage stamp size fragments spread out over 9 chapters. How they were able to put that together from the thousands of fragments they've seen and put all these together and call it the same thing is incredible. But they're all from the same manuscript. And at Revelation 13:18, it says the number of the beast is 616. Now, what's interesting about it is, well, there's a lot of interesting things. That becomes now our oldest witness to Revelation 13:18. And 4 years after it was published, I had the great honor and opportunity to look at that fragment in the flesh and to see it under a magnifying glass and a microscope. It had not been tampered with. But before 616, it has the letter eta. And if this is just a word by itself, we don't see that in other manuscripts, it means or. So what may have come before that is the number of the beast is 666 or 616. That would be the only place I know of where it lists 2 variants in the actual text of Revelation or text of the manuscript. But the oldest manuscript now has 616. And one of the 2 most important manuscripts, also very old, has 616. Is that the number of the beast? Well, most scholars to this day would say, I think 666 is the number of the beast. I kind of waffle on that. Even though all the rest of manuscripts have 666, one has 665, I think. But all the rest of them have something that would have been 666 for the original. I sometimes think 616 is the original, but most scholars would say, no, that's not the number of the beast. That's the neighbor of the beast. He just lives a few doors down, So, but here's the thing to think about. Oh, wow, that's an important variant. It's meaningful. Either one is meaningful. But I don't know of a single doctrinal statement of a church, a denomination, a Bible college, a seminary, any kind of Christian organization that says, we believe in the virgin birth. We believe in the deity of Christ. We believe in his death on the cross to pay for sins, his bodily resurrection. And we believe that the number of the beast is 616 or 666. It's important, but it's not that important. It does not touch any essential doctrine, but it just might send 7 tons of popular dispensational literature to the flames. So, anyway, those are some variants to think about that are meaningful, all of them, and viable and significant.
Well, as we near the end of our program, do you have some concluding thoughts or words of encouragement to share with our listeners about the subject of New Testament manuscripts, the Bible, how we can approach it without shaking our faith, maybe?
Our faith is grounded in history, but it's also shrouded in mystery. And that's the tension that genuine Christians have to wrestle with. And it's an intended intention by God himself. God became man in space-time history. I don't understand how the incarnation is even possible. I don't understand how eternity has no beginning. I can think of eternity starting from a certain point and then having no end. But if you think of eternity as having no beginning, then when did creation happen? Well, there wasn't a when, because there was no time before that began. Those are things that are a mystery to us. But the grounded in history part is what I want to focus on. When Jesus rose from the dead, the tomb was rolled back not to let him out, but to let his disciples in to see that he was no longer there. He had been raised from the dead. And Paul says, this is really, I think, significant along these lines. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says that at one time, more than 500 brothers and sisters, that is, believers in Christ, saw him after his resurrection. And then Paul adds, many of whom have fallen asleep, which is the idiom for Christian dead. Non-Christians don't fall asleep, they die. That's an interesting difference the Bible makes. But many of whom have fallen asleep, but most are still alive. Now, Paul is first making a historical statement. There's evidence, witnesses to the resurrection of Christ. And then he adds a personal statement that he knows about, that most of these people are still alive. How would he know that? Well, he'd been to Jerusalem back and forth a few times since he was a believer. And he may have interviewed a lot of these Christians. He may have found out about so many more. And so he's getting firsthand knowledge from these Christians who saw the resurrected Jesus. There is no other religion in the world that subjects itself to historical verification. The Bible itself puts itself at risk of embarrassment in that you read about miracles that Jesus did at a certain place at a certain time, how he healed this person or he raised that person from the dead. You do not have that in any major sacred text of any major religion. I'm not sure if you have it in the minor ones. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, probably written sometime between 120 and 140. The Gospels had already been accepted as canonical, the four Gospels. And how does this book want to get into that very elite group? Well, it names the author. It says the Gospel of Thomas. At the very end of it, it says this is by Thomas. You don't have that in our original manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They're all anonymous. There was this impulse of early sub-Christian groups to get accepted into the larger stream of orthodoxy, and they did so by attaching names of prominent people. There's a Gospel of Mary, there's a Gospel of Peter, there's a Gospel of Judas, which is a fascinating, thoroughly Gnostic work. But in Thomas and so many of these others, it's simply talking heads. In Thomas, you have 114 logia, and we do not see a single place that is named. There's no city, there's no region, there's no river, there's no geography point. There's no person that Jesus has healed or raised from the dead or healed their blindness or cast out demons. None of that is in the Gospel of Thomas. There's absolutely no way to verify that any of this actually goes back to Jesus, except when it's borrowing from the canonical Gospels and they put that in a space and time. So the Bible subjects itself to this, and therefore it puts itself at risk. For a Christian, why should the copying of the Bible be any different from our other beliefs? We believe in the resurrection not because we have the facts of the resurrection that could not possibly be interpreted any other way. It's a step of faith. But the evidence is all on the side of the bodily resurrection of Jesus, unless you decide miracles simply can't happen. In fact, those who say that Jesus was not raised from the dead admit the evidence is so strongly for the resurrection that if they believed that there was a God, Jesus had to be raised from the dead. They know the evidence is all there. Trusting the Bible means that we trust that the book that we hold in our hands, as Frederick Kenyon, the principal librarian at the British Library, this book that we hold in our hands is in all essential respects the veritable Word of God. In all essentials, it tells the truth. And in the vast majority of minor points, it's telling us how to live, what to do, what we should believe. But don't just take Kenyon's word or my word for it. Take Bart Ehrman's word for it. In the appendix to his paperback version of Misquoting Jesus, where the editors added an appendix to keep the book selling, in the first 3 months, I think 100,000 copies were sold. It hit number one on Amazon after he appeared on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. But the editors wanted to keep the sales up, so they made a paperback version after that. And on page 252, the editors asked Ehrman the question, why do you disagree with your mentor, Bruce Metzger, about these cardinal beliefs having been changed in the biblical manuscripts that we have, that we can't possibly tell what the original New Testament said, and we don't, essentials were changed. In other words, radical skepticism. What Ehrman says is, I don't disagree with my mentor. Essential doctrines are not in jeopardy by the textual variants in the manuscripts. So when you read Ehrman's book throughout, you get a totally different impression. He's a careful writer. He never says any doctrine is affected. He says a belief, maybe in terms of it being explicit, like the Trinity in the King James Bible at 1 John 5:7, but it's implicit throughout the New Testament. We see that very clearly. Ehrman actually believes essential doctrines are not at stake. And tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of kids who came out of a Christian background, went to college, had his book or books as required reading, abandoned the faith after that. But they didn't read the appendix. And if you boil it all down, we have in our hands the veritable Word of God. Most important thing that Christians should do is read their Bible and obey it. It does not matter if you have the Living Bible, the ESV, the RSV, the NRSV, if you have the CSB, the Net Bible, the NIV, any translation you're using, unless it's something like the New World Translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses, trust your Bible. Sure, there's differences, but it will affect the meaning of something in a given passage. It is not going to affect our beliefs. Bruce Metzger said, in The Case for Christ, he was interviewed by Lee Strobel, and he said, I've asked questions my whole life, and I can tell you right now that my faith is stronger than it ever was before because I know about these textual variants. I know about the scribes and their faithfulness to try to get it right, and how assiduously they poured themselves into their work. I trust my Bible, and that's where we need to leave it.
Amen. And when truth is on your side, and we believe it is, then a careful examination of the facts will support that. And that's, in fact, what it actually does. Well, Dr. Wallace, before we sign off on today's episode, I'd love for you to share with our listeners about your organization, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. What is your organization doing, and how might listeners benefit from, as well as maybe partner with CSNTM? And before you answer that, is there an easy way to remember CSNTM?
Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts is a mouthful. CSNTM is hard to remember, unless if you know who C.S. Lewis is, and most should know him as just a great English literature professor and great apologist, you have the first initials of CSNTM. And if you've ever watched Wizard of Oz, you know who Anti-M is. If you remember CS Anti-M, you have our initials, csntm.org. And we actually have on that website hundreds of thousands of high-quality digital images of pages from Greek New Testament manuscripts and even some other translations. CSNTM started in 2002 as an organization, nonprofit organization, with the initial purpose of getting every single Greek New Testament manuscript in the world digitized so that scholars could have access to it and decipher these texts to help them in producing a more accurate Greek New Testament. And we were the very first organization to digitize any Greek New Testament manuscripts. We did it with our state-of-the-art 4-megapixel camera. Wow. And it took 90 seconds to download an image onto our computer, and then we check, oh, it's too dark. I mean, it was just painstakingly slow to digitize these manuscripts in the beginning. Our purpose is to get every single one of them digitized. Our Greek New Testament manuscripts are in 253 different locations throughout the world. And we've been to more than 50 of them, so about a fifth of them. We have on our website either digital images that we have taken or digital images that now in-house libraries, some of the larger libraries are doing it themselves, and some are just microfilms that we have from other places. We have about 2,000 manuscripts on our website that somebody can look at on their computer. It's incredible. CSNTM is beginning to stand at the head of the stream of all future translations of the Bible, because it's our images that are used by scholars to produce a scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament that then translators use for their work. And I'm very excited that such a humble beginning, such a small organization as it is even now, is really having an impact down the line on every Christian in the world. That's really exciting. And we put these images online so you can see exactly what the differences are, because we always should be pursuing truth at all costs and lay the evidence out and let people deal with it as they wish.
And so I assume people can go there and also contribute if they would like to join you.
If you go to our site, you'll see a little button that says donate. You can go there and we suggest amounts. Would you like to give $5 million or $10 million? But you can donate whatever amount you want. The most important kind of donor we're looking for, though, is someone who joins the Scribal Fellowship. It's something we just launched just a few days ago. Scribal Fellowship, we used to have a thing called Circle of Friends, but now it's Scribal Fellowship. And it's if you commit to donating money every month, and you get access to things that no others do. I think a couple times a year, I will have live Q&A times with just the people who are in Scribal Fellowship. They get to go to our events for free. And we have an upcoming conference for scholars and anybody else that would like to come. I would encourage listeners to get on Circle of Friends and contribute $25 a month. CSNTM has discovered 76 now New Testament manuscripts that Western scholars never knew about before. And we're adding to the fund of Greek New Testament manuscripts.
Nice. Well, Dr. Wallace, thank you for taking a substantial amount of time out of your very busy schedule to share with our listeners about the discipline of textual criticism. And thank you for the leading work you and your team are doing for the cause of Christ and to benefit the Church of Jesus Christ. I'm personally thankful for the love of Greek that you've given me and thousands of other Dallas Theological Seminary graduates whom you've taught over your many years of service.
Well, thank you, Paul. This has been a delight to chat with you again. It's been a long time. And God's richest blessings on you as you teach students about the theology that we derive from Scripture, because that's our deposit of revelation. And what theology does is brings those things that are in these historical documents into an organized format so we know really what we believe. And I love your work. It's great. And I love this podcast you're doing. It's really, really exciting.
And to our listeners, I want to encourage you to head over to the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Their website is csntm.org. That's csntm.org. That is it for today's Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I hope you'll join us again next week for another great podcast episode. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, theologymatters.com.